I'm Eliot Parker. I'm the panel moderator for this session this afternoon called Stirring the Pot, Stoking the Fire of Conflict, and I've got three just not only terrific people but fantastic writers here. I read some of their stuff prior to moderating. Great stuff. So if you're looking for something to add to your to-be-read pile, stop by the table and get all of them. Get one book from all books of all of them, actually, from all of them. But really just terrific writing, and I'm so honored and delighted to be on a panel with them today. Our first panelist is John Holman, sitting to my left. He's the author of the short story collection Squabble and Other Stories, and also a novel called Luminous Mysteries. His stories have appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, Mississippi Review, and other anthologies. He's also written on issues related to teaching creative writing. Our second panelist in the middle here, she gets to be the rose between all these thorns, is Anissa Gray, and she was born and raised in Western Michigan. She's the author of the critically acclaimed 2019 novel, The Care and Feeding of Ravenously Hungry Girls, which is amazing. She's also a journalist whose work has been featured in publications such as The Washington Post, CNN, The Cut, and other locations. So I'm delighted to have her as a panelist. And down on the end is Andy Davidson. He is the Bram Stoker Award-nominated author of In the Valley of the Sun, The Boatman's Daughter, and also of the recent book called The Hollow Kind, which is just amazing and fantastic if you haven't read it yet. He holds an MFA from the University of Mississippi, otherwise known as Ole Miss, where I teach. So we have that in common. Both have those Ole Miss roots. So I'm really delighted to have all of these folks with us here today, and I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have. We will save some time at the end for Q&A. So as we're discussing, as things come up, if you have a question or something you'd like to ask the panel, we'll be happy to get to that a little bit later on in our session. So I wanted to sort of just start with maybe defining some terms and ideas, because I think as readers and as writers, we hear that term conflict a lot. You got to have conflict, got to have internal conflict, kind of external conflict in your characters and your storylines and all of that. So when you think about conflict, either as a writer or a reader or as it applies to your own work, if you were to kind of define that or sort of elaborate on what that idea or concept means, how would you define that both? It could be in your own work or what you've read or what you see in literature in general. When you hear that term conflict, what are some things that you would add to that, or some prescriptive terms and ideologies that you would connect to that? So we'll just kind of start with John and just work our way down.
Hi, everybody. Well, I'm primarily a short story writer, and I'm not great at plotting, so conflict, when I think of it, I think of strong. Thank you. When I think of conflict, I think of strong plots, and that's not my forte, really. But I will say that Janet Burroway, who was a novelist, but also wrote a great book about writing fiction. It's called Writing Fiction, in fact. And, she has this little formula that says desire plus danger equals drama. And so a character wants something and faces some really opposition to getting that, which is the danger element. And a desire coming against opposition creates conflict, creates drama. And but I like to think of it as desire plus opposition equals tension, And so I try to work to create tension in my stories rather than, I think of it that way rather than thinking of it as conflict,
This is an interesting question for me, because similarly, I'm not someone who initially plots. I get there the hard way, but it's not something I think about initially. And I also don't think, when I sit down to write, I'm not thinking about necessarily the elements of craft. So I guess I don't really think about conflict. But what I do think about are sort of the elements that make up conflict. And those for me are just sort of the things of life. So I'll start with character. And it's, you know, what does my character want? You know, where are they going? And then along the way, there are those obstacles. For my characters, a lot of those obstacles are emotional. Sometimes it's another person, and sometimes it's an issue. So for me, so those are the things that sort of, for me in my mind, make up conflict. But as a general concept, when I sit down to write, I'm not really thinking about that. What I'm thinking about is, how do I get my character from here to there? What is emotionally true for them? And I think if I'm doing my job and I answer those questions, then I'm going to create some conflict along the way. And you're going to care enough about the character to see how they move through those obstacles.
Yeah, I would just reiterate everything that's been said, and the Burroway formula is actually a pretty good one. I think the word desire is in there, so for me, conflict springs out of the character wants something, they can't get it. Whoever is keeping the character from getting what they want, they can't get it, that's conflict.
So you all talk a little bit about, you know, when you sit down to write and sort of constructing the ideas for your stories and kind of where you want your characters to go. When you think about this idea of conflict, and I know we've got several different genres represented here, short stories and novels and horror genre, how do you balance the internal conflict with the external conflict in your stories? And I know some of this is genre specific, depending on you know, obviously a short story, it might lean one way or the other depending on the story or the theme, as opposed to a novel, as opposed to a horror story. But is there a formula in terms of engaging the reader with the right amount of internal conflict versus external conflict, or does it depend on the story? Does it depend on kind of your take on what it is that you're writing about? You know, Anissa talked about, you know, people and real circumstances. Does it just depend on those circumstances that those characters are in that particular story? How do you balance that? How do you get it to where the reader sees enough external conflict, you know, pressures on the protagonist, but also is kind of internalizing and dealing with those issues as well as the stories unfold? Can you guys comment on that for just a minute?
These are hard questions, aren't they?
You and Andy, I think.
You know, as Anissa said, I don't usually start with, you know, with the whole story in mind. I don't know what I'm going to write, you know, and it may start with an image that I want to see, you know, showcase, you know, in a scene, or a piece of dialogue I overhear, or you know, or a memory that comes up from, you know, that I experienced from childhood. But eventually I've got to ask myself, what does my character want, you know, and then that becomes the story, you know, the character trying to achieve a certain goal or satisfy some need or desire. But balancing, so that's an internal conflict, you know, wanting something, you know, and but then, you know, where in the world is this character, and what are the sort of aspects of the setting and other people that could be opposition to what that character wants. So it really just depends on, you know, how I conceive of the space the character inhabits, you know, and what kinds of things within that setting and within that place and time that could be obstacles to the character getting what she wants. You know, if a woman wants to, her ex-husband, say, is in the hospital on his deathbed, and she wants to go visit him one last time, maybe to, you know, see that maybe she still loves him and wants to communicate that before he dies or something. So that's an internal desire to get to the hospital before he dies. So what are the external conflicts that are going to get in the way, you know, of getting there on time? And it could be because she doesn't have gas money, you know, so she's looking through couch cushions, looking for quarters to quarters won't do it anymore, but you know, but money to pay a friend who wants gas or pay a taxi to get to the hospital. It could be a storm outside, so that impeding the travel, you know. So it could be late at night and or getting to be late at night and visiting hours are about to end. You know, so the pressures of time, pressures of place, pressures of weather, you know, can all be external conflicts. You know.
Yeah, this is a really good question for me, because I've actually never thought of it from this perspective. But I write a lot in first person, so I spend a lot of time dealing with that sort of internal conflict and really sort of delving into that. And now as I think about it, I think I use sort of the external conflict John described really well here to sort of physically move and in some ways emotionally move my characters through the story. I mean, it doesn't necessarily divide up quite that cleanly, but as I sit here and really sort of think about this really interesting question that I've never thought of, I'm just like, you know, I do really think I rely a lot on emotional, that sort of internal conflict. I'm really comfortable writing in that space, and then sort of those external conflicts to sort of drive the narrative forward in some ways that sort of keep the reader sort of engaged almost in a more physical kind of way.
I'm a, I don't know if you would say acolyte or adherent, but I believe in a lot of what he has to say in his books, although I've never taken one of his seminars. But I have a couple of creative writing students in the room who are you know what I'm gonna say. Robert McKee. Right, exactly. McKee, yeah, when you call his name out, people either groan, laugh, or remember that scene in Adaptation with, gosh, I'm blanking. Nicolas Cage, who's the actor that plays him though? It's
Brian Cox.
Brian Cox, yeah, which is amazing. But anyway, McKee talks about this idea that we have conflict through characters that want and desire things. It's not we've all talked about that in various forms. But he also kind of layers onto it something that I think is really interesting. It's the idea that characters have desires. And it's not just external physical desires. There are unconscious desires, right? Stop laughing, Mitch. There are things that characters want, and then there are things they don't know they want. And sometimes when they go in pursuit of the thing they want, they discover the thing they didn't know they want. Or the thing that they didn't know they want, that they discover they want, comes into conflict with the thing they thought they wanted. Right? So, as an example, in my first book, I have a serial killer. His chief conscious desire when we first meet him is to kill women. And as the narrative progresses, his chief desire that he sort of discovers about himself is that he wants a family. And so in doing what he's been doing, he moves away from that, but in the process of also discovering that he wants a family, he learns that because of the things that he previously did, his other choices that he made, he can never have that. And so there's a new place that he's taken to as a character through that, those different levels of like internal and external conflict kind of competing and coming into conflict with each other. And so it can add for some really rich character progression, I think.
Very good. We'll come back to conflict in just a second, but I wanted to ask all three of you, how do you write? How do you write? Where do you write? When do you write? Are you a, pen and notepad kind of writer? Do you sit down at the computer and write? Do you write early in the morning, late at night? Tell us a little bit about your process. When do you write? How do you write? How do you do it? How long, you can even talk about this if you want, how long from the time you get an idea really sort of percolating or really moving forward in your mind, from that period to the first draft, how long does it normally take you? Can be that rough first draft, but things like that. How do you write? When do you write? How does it work for you?
Okay, well, it's different now than it used to be for me. I used to be able to get up early enough to write in the morning before other responsibilities, but that was before my children were born, so that was, 30 years ago when I was able to do that. And now, because I teach full-time and teach writing, and I'm using a lot of creative energy and time helping my students in reading their work. I don't really get a chance to write regularly like I would prefer to until classes are out for summer, or holiday break. And but if I've got something started, percolating, then it's easy for me to sort of go to it at spare moments and work on it. It's hard to generate ideas when I'm in the midst of a teaching semester. But I did write this summer because I didn't teach this summer, and I write every day when I am writing, and I'm thinking about it all the time. I take notes in carry around a notebook and take notes that way, or I pick, now that I got an iPhone, I can put notes on the phone. And then I'll transfer those notes to the computer. I start trying to use them in a scene somehow. And I give myself a modest goal to write 500 to 1,000 words a day when I'm committing myself to writing every day. And I really like that modest goal of 500 words, because then if I do that and do more, then I can really celebrate, But if I give myself too big a goal, then I'm always disappointed in myself, So I don't know if that quite answers the question, but that's kind of how I do it,
Well, I still have a day job, so I'm usually up at the desk at 5 a.m. and I write from like 5 to 8. Working from home has been amazing because I get back some hours that aren't spent traveling, so that's really helped. So I'll write from like 5 to 8, and that's the real sort of thought generating, thinking, coming up with new stuff time, that period. And then I'll, go to work and, do what I do. But sort of throughout the day, when I get some spare time, I do sort of the other writing type stuff. Some researchy stuff. I'll go back and look at another chapter with fresh eyes, see where I want to edit, that type of thing. So early morning writing, and then picking up things that are in progress later in the day if I get the time. I try to write every day. I'm someone who can't. I'm thinking about my story all the time. I can make minor developments in my head and keep notes. I'll usually get lines or words, and I'll keep note. I use like Evernote, so that just sort of populates at all times. So I'll keep notes there, but I don't really get traction until I'm doing that early morning 5 to 8 new idea generating writing. So that's that. I don't have like a word count goal for myself each day, so I just write to time. Whatever happens in that time happens. Sometimes nothing happens or very little happens, and then sometimes it's a really productive day. So that's why it's important to sort of show up for work every single day, at least for me. About 4:30. It's hard. But I don't know if anybody's gone through menopause, but I can't get, or have been through, I cannot get up like I used to. So it is really a trial for me to keep this schedule. I'm just putting that out there. I'm just saying.
Wow. Yeah. I got nothing to follow that with. No, it's really boring. I teach online. I teach in the classroom, and so I have flexible time during the week, and I work it in as I can. And my job kind of demands that I do it, and so I do it. If I didn't have my job, I'd probably do it more. But my process is not set in terms of time that I get to spend with it, or word counts, or hours, or anything like that. So when I approach a new project, I start a notebook and I fill up that notebook. And usually by the time I get to the end of that notebook with ideas or notes or characters or sketches or whatever, I'm ready to go. And I write an outline. I piece together, I do play. I piece together everything and try to get the ending before I start writing the first page. I think it was John Irving who said something like he writes the actual last sentence first and then writes toward it. Can't do that, but if you can have an idea in your head of where you're going, then it's easier to get there. But yeah, I think 500 to 1,000 is a really good goal for a daily word count, because that's what, 2 to 4 pages if you're double spacing, and so you're maybe every now and then the fire catches on and you've got 8 pages at the end of the day and you get to feel like you've really done something. But yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned John Irving. Was one of my favorite writers, and 2 of my favorite books ever are Cider House Rules and A Prayer for Owen Meany. So if you're trying to get into John Irving, or you've heard people talk about him, I would start with those 2. But all the stuff's good. Those 2 are just simply amazing. So I want to go back to conflict for just a second, and I wanted to ask you all something that you kind of brought up, because you all write in different genres. If voice matters in establishing conflict, or how you manage that, given that, John, you write short stories. Anissa, you talked about you write first person a lot. Andy does horror stories. Establishing conflict with voice from either the first person character, first person narrator perspective, or in a short story where you've got 7,500 words or less to kind of get the conflict going with a voice, or how it's done in the horror genre. How do you all do that? Is that something that you're constantly revising or trying to get right when you're establishing conflict in your story in terms of the voice and whose eyes or whose shoulder is the reader on as we're following the developments of your narrative? How does all that work for you? How do you handle that in terms of kind of linking those 2 concepts together?
I really never think about voice as a element of conflict. I hadn't thought about it that way before. So let me try to think about it now.
This will be my last panel moderator. I'm going to be fired after today, so I'm going to go down in the place of glory. Sorry.
But these are good questions, though, and it's worth thinking about, Well, one of my students asked me early in the semester to define voice, and I didn't quite know how to do it, but I guess it has to do with tone, and setting a mood, but I think, just beginning, I think I use setting a lot, I guess, not a lot necessarily, but I think setting is a way to establish a voice by describing setting early on in the story, whether it, and then the character's sort of relationship to the setting, whether the character's feeling annoyed by where she is, starting there can begin to establish some tension and conflict, just the mood of the character being at odds with or in opposition to the setting. So, establishing voice can, I guess, begin to establish tension at least, if the character is feeling some irritation, annoyance, trepidation, fear early on in the story. hope that's helpful.
You mentioned the concept of sort of, you know, who the reader is with at any given, you know, the voice of the character. So I write a lot in first person, but I also tend to write sort of braided narratives. So you're in the point of view oftentimes of several different people in the novel. And one of the things that I enjoy doing is having an event viewed from the perspective of different characters. And sort of within that, you know, there's inherent conflict because, you know, we all see and experience things quite differently. I'm one of 5 kids, and my siblings and I will talk about a particular moment that we all remember, but we all remember it quite differently. We all experienced it quite differently. So I really love sort of this, you know, the multi-character point of view, typically first person, although occasionally I'll do a third person for a character. Did that in the last novel. But, and they all sort of experience this monumental thing, and they see it differently, and the conflict that can arise out of that.
I think that when I sit down to write short fiction, I tend to, for some reason, default to first person. I don't know why. Maybe it just comes quicker. I don't know. But usually with a short story, it's such a reduction or such a boiled down, compressed bit of time for me that the problem becomes apparent really quickly. So the conflict kind of enters into it within the first couple of paragraphs because of the voice of the character sort of guiding me into what the story is about. So I don't really plan short stories in that way, but novels, yeah, like I tend to write in a third person limited most of the time. If I'm in a chapter, it's from one character's point of view, but it's not a first person narration. So it's hard to say like how to parse out what does voice do for conflict and that sort of thing. I don't know, because I think of voice as like how I write. Like my voice is different from your voice, or my voice is different from any other writer's voice. And so we find it takes us a while to get our footing and establish our voice. So I sort of think of those as just separate things. I don't know. But then again, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. It's a hard question. And I was the third person to answer, and I had all the time.
Yes, as I said, this will be my last panel moderating session, so we might as well go down in a blaze of glory and do it well. But no, those were great. Thank you all for that. So we've talked a little bit about conflict. We mentioned John Irving a minute ago, or Andy did, as a really good writer. Are there any authors who do conflict well that you're a fan of, or if someone out here is wrestling with conflict or how to set up conflict in a story or a book they're working on that you recommend they read in terms of setting it up well? Do you have some favorites, or do you have an author that you think does it really well that you'd recommend folks check out if they're not familiar with? And you can go in any order. Everyone wants to answer first, second, third. I'm just kind of going left to right or right to left.
It's been working for me.
It's not working out so well for me. But you know, I'm teaching a lot of books this semester, and some of them are short story collections and some novels. And I tend to sort of like what it is I'm reading at the time, you know. And so I've been reading some stories by an author named Daniel Evans, who wrote a collection of stories called Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self. And so that's some conflict right there in that title. And some stories by an author called Kali Fajardo Einstein, who is Latinx indigenous writer from Colorado, and her stories are about such characters as she is, and you know, I mean, there, you know, some of the things she's writing about, people's sort of generational experience of violence against women. So it's kind of inherent conflict just in, you know, being in a world where that happens. But the stories are really more about, you know, the violence is off to the side, and it's really about the sort of the after effects of families that have experienced that kind of violence. You know, another book that I'm teaching is Dare Dare by Tommy Orange, which is a novel, but it's sort of, you know, interestingly, it has an interesting form in that each chapter it has a title that corresponds to the name of a specific character that's featured in that chapter. In that book, you know, all the characters are moving toward this one event of a powwow where something significant happens. Tommy Orange is a Native American writer who's writing about Oakland, California, contemporary urban Native Americans. So those are three books at least that, I mean, I like the way they form their stories. You know, I get engrossed in them, and they sort of establish something of, you know, they establish character really well. And I think that, again, as I said early on about when I was speaking about tension, you know, if you can get to if you can sympathize with the character and what the character wants, and then, you know, the character is motivated, and then there's a specific value to what that character is motivated to achieve, and then put in some opposition, then you've got conflict. And all these writers that I'm talking about manage to do that.
So I'll just throw out some books I've read recently. The first thing that comes to mind just in talking about conflict is the novel Trust, and I'm completely blanking on the author's name, and I'm sorry, but it is 4 novellas. He won the Pulitzer, so for a reason. It's 4 novellas, and the novellas themselves are in conflict with each other because you don't know quite what to believe. It's the story of you know, a rich man and his wife. You know, the first novella sort of sets the story for you, and then you get the next novella that's told from the husband's point, and it's completely in conflict with the one that came next, and so on and so on. So it's just an incredible, you know, bit of storytelling in and of itself, and I mean, it's just conflict on all levels.
Hernan Diaz.
Yes, yes. Hernan Diaz. And it won the Pulitzer this year. And another author who's great with conflict is Rebecca Makkai. I actually am in the middle of, I have some questions for you, her latest novel, and it's just an incredible examination, almost an excavation of a narrative we're given, and then pulling back and seeing what's true about it. And you have all of these different characters with their point of, it's not a braided narrative, it's told from the perspective of one character, but you have all of these different characters seated throughout, and you're trying to figure out what's true, and you're trying to figure out if the original narrative is true, which in a lot of ways is like Trust. Another book, because I'm just a huge raw fan, The Matrix. It's conflictual, but on a very sort of mostly emotional level. You have a 12th century character who's actually based on a real person, Marie de France, who is trying to come to terms with a life that she did not envision for herself in a nunnery, and, you know, going forward and ultimately becoming the abbess. And it's a true arc. It's, you know, she's a young woman until her death. It's just an incredible bit of storytelling.
The book I always think of as an example of really great conflict is True Grit, Charles Portis.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I mean, you start that book, and going back to the previous question about voice and conflict, that's a great example of how a character's voice can be the soul of a novel. So you start out that novel with Maddie Ross, who has a singular goal, and that's to avenge the death of her father and bring Tom Chaney to justice or kill him. And so as we proceed through the narrative, it's just a constant series of obstacles and confrontations that she's presented with finding someone, a marshal, who will take her into the wilderness and pursue this man, and they begin the pursuit, and then complications ensue with that. Complications ensue from the choice of Rooster Cogburn as the marshal, and I'm sure like most of us are familiar with the films, but if you've never read the book, it is one of the most transportive and beautiful literary experiences you will ever experience. I promise you. Yeah, it's an amazing book by an Arkansas writer.
And as you can see, not only do we have great writers here, but we have really great readers and really diverse reading tastes and preferences and things that they like, so that's really great. We wanted to take this moment here during the session to open it up for questions. If you folks have questions of our panelists, either about conflict or things that they have mentioned or talked about or alluded to that you want more clarification on, we just ask that you, if you could stand up and say it loud and say it proud so we can hear you. And then for those folks watching us online, we will repeat your question to make sure that it's recorded and folks can hear that are watching us online. So we'll open it up now if anyone has questions. Okay, yes ma'am, we'll start with you in the back.
Okay. So I find that a lot of times when I'm putting my characters in situations, I let them out a little too easily. Do you have any advice on torturing them a little bit better?
So the question was about torture? No. The question was letting characters off the hook a little too easily, or maybe they don't get their just desserts like maybe they should. What are your all's thoughts on that, about how to make sure they get what's coming to them?
My immediate thought is, if you put a character through something and at the end of that moment or scene nothing's different, then it's not working. It's not added anything to the narrative momentum. But if there's a change, if you put that character through something awful, but it's not quite awful enough to affect their life in some way or affect change, that's where you need to be going. So it might not be a matter of like really torturing them. It might just be a matter of just a little further. Sorry, I just jumped.
No, I think that's perfect. I'll just jump in and say, I would, and it's jumping off what Andy said, I would just, sort of consider the genesis of it, the beginning of the idea in the first place. So you get to the end of the scene and you feel like it's unfulfilling for your character. In a situation like that, I'm going to ask, why am I writing this in the first place? How does this serve the story? How does this serve the character? So those are always the questions that, should be driving us as we're writing, as we're going back and reevaluating scenes and lines and dialogue. How does this serve the story? Is this moving things forward? If not,
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I think that the word that comes to mind for me is grapple. If you just allow your character to really grapple with the problem. But again, when is there enough grappling? I've had students sometimes will end the story with a character's death. A short story. So and to me that's letting the character off the hook. Instead of allowing the character to live and let the reader imagine the consequences of that character's choices. And how that character might suffer or deal with them. So, keeping characters alive is my, and let them really have to face the consequences of their choices.
Thank you.
I think somebody had their hand up for another question. Oh, yes ma'am, in the back.
I've been advised by someone who actually wrote more screenplays than novels, and trying to get me to be very out front with the conflict, very abrupt, and that's not my nature. How do you feel about trying to apply screenwriting rules to novels?
So the question was, this concept in screenwriting of starting with the conflict pretty strong right from the beginning. How do you all feel about applying that to novels or short fiction or horror? Does it work? Can it work? Or does it just depend on the story that you're trying to tell or what your goals are?
Well, Andy said earlier something about getting the conflict on the page early in a short story, and I think that's a good idea, you know, because you have to hook the reader somehow, you know, and better do it fast or she'll put it down and start reading something else. But the main conflict might not be on the page early, and maybe some other thing, you know, that is of interest, you know, in the first sentence or paragraph that keeps the reader reading toward what the main conflict turns out to be. But you know, something puzzling should occur early, you know, I think. We'll never learn.
No, I would just say that I think you have to have some level of friction up front. You know, certainly it all depends on the story you're trying to tell, but some level of friction, again, it may not be the main point of it, but there needs to be some friction that the reader can sort of say, I'm interested in going a bit further and seeing what's happening here.
Just to add to that, I think screenwriting techniques are invaluable in novel writing, especially if you're someone that has trouble finishing something. That's where screenwriting techniques really help you. It helped me finish my first novel.
How so?
Well, I spent about 10 years after I got out of grad school not being able to finish it. And so when I finally sat down and went through the discipline of crafting a thing from start to finish before I started just putting words on the page, that's when suddenly the whole thing was there. And it was easier to write to it.
We've got time for one more question. Someone else have a question? Yes, sir.
So, curious about if you have predilections to or choices or what you think is a good idea for how many sort of lines of conflict to layer. You know, obviously there's probably going to be that major overarching conflict, but you know, we all deal with multiple things throughout a day or throughout an adventure. Curious about your approaches or advice in that arena.
So the question was advice or approaches to multiple layers of conflict in a story. How many is too many? Is there too many? What should be a sweet spot, or is there such a thing? What do you guys think?
In short story writing, I've kind of discovered that I kind of try to use the word, you know, break two conflicts within a story. You know, like there's the thing and then there's the other thing. And so recently completed a draft of a short story about a kid in 1968 who works delivering for a florist. And his partner on the job, you know, drives the step van, the florist van, and my protagonist is not allowed to drive. He just drives shotgun all the time. So there's a conflict between these two guys in that truck. But there's also a conflict for the protagonist who is in love with a girl at his school that his best friend is started going out with. So got those two conflicts going on at the same time. And so I like to figure out how to put together two things and then figure out how to make them work together in the same story. You know, that's kind of the kind of puzzle I like to play with. You know, so in a short story, you know, two conflicts.
In novels, I would say the only limitation is I don't know, I hate to say things like, this is the way you should do it. But my instinct would be if there is a conflict that I come up with, conflict 7, say, we got 6, 7 conflicts. Number 7, while the previous 6 kind of tie back into the main conflict. Like say there's a big uber conflict with the narrator, with the main character, and then there's subplots for other characters who have conflicts. But all of those things have to kind of tie together eventually into some, not necessarily into a literal, like everything happens to form a union or something, but at some point they have to gel and be about each other. And if they don't, and if it's a random thing that happens, that may not work, or it may not be working. I don't know, but it could work. I mean, it's hard to say there's a rule there.
Yeah, no, I just second that. It's a great question because I'm in the middle, not in the middle, I'm in the first quarter of writing a new novel, and I'm thinking about that very thing. Like, how much is too much? You know, do I have too much going on here? You know, I have a bunch of ideas swirling. You know, how do I corral them? And I think Andy made a good point with sort of avoid the random thing. You know, the thing that's just sort of out there, like, you know, what the hell is that happening over there? You know, and how does it relate to what's happening over here? So, yeah, that's pretty much what comes up for me. Avoid the random thing. But it's a great question because when you're sitting down, when you're particularly early stages of writing a novel, and particularly if you're not a plotter, and I'm not a plotter, I sort of work my way through the novel and sort of get a sense of what I'm seeing as I go. There is, I think I do layer on too much conflict. Those first couple of drafts are bloated and just, you know, just all manner of shit going on. So it's really important to be, you know, as a writer, also a good editor when the time comes to it. And it gets directly to your point of not having too many sort of random threads out there that you don't tie off at the end. Yeah, novel writing is hard.
I just wanted to say that my prescription of 2 conflicts is just random. So when I think about that story that I'm writing, it's set in 1968 for a reason too. Like I said, and there's a volatile time in America, you know, with civil rights and assassinations and you know, free love movement and all that sort of stuff. You know, so all that's going on in the background of this character's experience, and so they constitute aspects of conflict as well. You know, so it's a hard question to answer, but.
Well, I can certainly attest to having read the works of our 3 panelists today. Everything that they've talked about today and advice that they have given is present in their work and then some. So if you have not checked out their work, please, I would encourage you to do so. Great storytelling, great writing. No matter where you are on your writing journey or reading journey as a reader or writer, you won't be disappointed. 3 great sets of books to add to your to-be-read pile. And I want to give thanks to them for being on our panel today as we talked about stoking the fire of conflict. So let's give them a round of applause.